Today we're going to talk about race and ethnicity, so important, and of course with everything that's going on in the news today, this is really important for us to think about sociologically. Your book does, as it always does, a good job of kind of laying out the main concepts, so I'm just going to jump into a couple of studies here. And one question that we hear, not just in sociology, but I think in our culture, is whether racism still exists today. And on the one hand, we can look at different types of evidence to try to get a handle on this. And if we look at a lot of surveys, there's very low levels of support for racial segregation and other measures of inequality and discrimination and prejudice. So here we see a couple of charts, and I'll just go through it real quickly. The pink line is the disapproval responses, and then the blue is the approval responses. And the question of interracial marriage, do you approve or disapprove? Kind of as we expect, and what we like to see and what we hope to see is that there's a lot more acceptance of interracial marriages over time. This is tracking 1958 to 2011, and looking at a similar question about segregation in schools. Essentially, same general issues that we see. There's a lot more acceptance or just agreement that schools should be integrated, with that blue line right there. So nearly like 98 or so percent, according to this survey here. And then, we can see that too with this question. You kind of get the point, but just in terms of residential segregation, you see how there's been change in terms of that as well. So on the one hand, that's good news because it sounds like things are on the up and up, and a lot more approval of racial issues and civil rights issues for racial and ethnic minorities. And the other component here is that the other question is that this survey data isn't necessarily a surefire indication that racism has ended, because a lot of time people's survey responses are different from their behaviors, and our attitudes are different from our actions, and there might be other components that are going on in terms of just the reality of race in our world. Subtle racism, and we hear this a lot, especially the past several weeks. Just this discussion about race and how race matters, and these everyday conversations that we sometimes hear about race. This rhetoric of being colorblind. A lot of scholars, and especially a lot of activists, see that is problematic. So that still downplays the possibility that race and racism play in our American world, in our American life. And also these discussions and these conversations we sometimes hear about, well, if Black people just were more motivated, or if Hispanic and Latinos just tried harder to succeed, that's still, there's still this implied and subtle racism tied to that. And again, just a cartoon, I don't remember what textbook I found this from, but just this idea of, the overt racist, the KKK member versus the colorblind racist. There's something potentially problematic about this colorblind racism, because the reality is that we do see people's skin colors, and we do recognize race, and we need to be attentive to that and aware of that, and just observant of that. So again, if we look at other surveys from that same pile of data that we were looking at earlier, on average, African Americans have worse jobs, income, housing than white people. Do you think these differences are because African Americans just don't have the motivation or willpower to pull themselves up out of poverty? And you see that it's essentially a 50-50 split in terms of responses to this. So part of what we're seeing here is that basically half the population is saying if African Americans would just try harder, work harder, if they had more willpower, their lives would be better. Whereas the other 50% might recognize that there's something beyond that. There's something structural that's in place that's impeding that. Do you agree or disagree with the statements? Really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If Blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as whites. And again, not a whole lot of change over time. If you look at 1986 to 2008, really just a tiny little bump over time, and how there's been just slightly more people agreeing with that statement. So not a lot of drastic change in that. Do you agree or disagree with the statement? Irish, Italian, Jewish, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do so without the same, or do the same without any special favors. And again, there is a slight increase, but not a dramatic increase in those numbers. And really what this is showing is there's not a lot of change in this over time, whether you look at the disagree or the agree responses to this. So that's showing that there's another dimension that we're not seeing a lot of change in. One other issue, and I won't go through all the details here, but there's been some content analyses of representations of welfare and welfare recipients. And African Americans are approximately 28% of welfare recipients, but 60% of individuals appearing in photos representing welfare are African American. So, just the reality versus the perception, or just the portrayal is vastly different. And there's a much larger, and again, the idea here is that if we look at those images and those representations, we might imagine or assume that that's reflective of reality, and it's showing that there's or at least suggesting, through those images, there's twice as many African Americans receive welfare than is actually the case. And again, we won't talk too much today about welfare in much depth, but this is something across the board. People of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, benefit from welfare and need welfare at one point in their lives. So it really is not just something that people of color use, or the resource that's just in place for people of color. So one other way that we can see if discrimination exists is by doing studies of the labor market and work opportunities. And to do this, we're going to look at a really well-known study there's a lot of press in it. Whenever this study was first published, there was a lot of media coverage on it. So I'll tell you a little bit about this particular study. And it's an experiment. The interesting thing that these researchers did was they they actually found and searched for actual help wanted ads, job ads, in a couple of different cities in the United States, and they created these fictitious resumes and submitted those resumes online. And I'll talk about more of the details and the differences, but to try to analyze how race might play a role in the labor market, they gave some maybe white-sounding names, or at least kind of neutral or generic sounding names. Emily Johnson, Greg Johnson, those were the names that were on some of the resumes that they submitted. And then they used more black-sounding names on some of the other resumes that they submitted to those very same jobs. So it would be Lakeisha Johnson, Jamal Johnson. So this is a subtle way that they were trying to kind of throw a race into the mix here, because a lot of time, well, of course, it's illegal to make employment decisions based on race, but the reality is that there's still ways, even if we're just looking at resumes, that we can still read race into those resumes. So we can read names and assume that they might be African Americans, or certainly assume that they might be Hispanic or Latinos. And that's part of what they were trying to gauge here, because this was on online submission. The employers never saw these applicants face to face. So like I said, the first issue the variable actually that they manipulated was race, or at least the perception of race through those different sets of names that I told you about. And then the second item that they were trying to tease or manipulate so they could study in this particular piece was the quality of the resume. So they had higher quality resumes where they would have more skills, more credentials, higher GPAs if they listed their graduation, college or degree attainment from higher status universities, and more elaborate work histories and volunteer histories and more elaborate references, etc. Those would be, of course, the high quality resumes. And then the lower quality resumes would be those where there were gaps in their employment, or less prestigious workplaces that they worked in the past, or less prestigious degrees or institutions that they graduated from, GPAs, lower GPAs, etc. And so what they did in this study is they would submit 4 resumes to each job, and it would be where they would have, a quote white sounding resume or a black sounding name resume that was both high quality, and then a second that was lower quality. So a white high quality resume, black high quality resume, white low quality resume, and a black low quality resume. And what they found was that there was a higher callback rate for the white applicants, or the white sounding applicants, because again, no one ever saw these submissions since they were totally online. And for every 10 submissions, the white applicants would receive a callback, whereas for the black applicants, it was for every 15 submissions. So the crazy thing about this is that sometimes those resumes were identical. The only thing that was different was the name, or the ethnic sounding name, or the white sounding name. So that seems to suggest, and they did this to 1,300 jobs, or 1,300 resumes that they submitted. So it wasn't just a handful of cases that they found this tended to be the pattern, but overwhelmingly in these hundreds and hundreds of resumes that they submitted. So here's the pretty complex statistical running, or the table that illustrates this. And really what I'm going to draw your attention to is the percent callback for white names versus African American names. So again, even when they were identical resumes, a stark difference in that percentage callback. And a 50% racial gap, that's what that's illustrating. Trying to get through this quickly before time runs out, because I'm trying to make it just 15 minutes. The other item that we do see is that race affects the rewards of a better resume. So like I said, they submitted high quality and low quality resumes for white applicants and black applicants. So we would think in this world where, we're equal, or we're equitable, and the workplace is equitable, or we hope that's the case, or assume that's the case, that if you had a better resume, regardless of your name, regardless of the color of your skin, that you'd get more interest in your application. And that certainly wasn't the case. The white sounding resumes that had a higher quality resume had a 30% higher callback compared to white resumes with lower quality resumes. So the 30% jump, which you would expect and hope that you'd get more interest if you had a higher quality resume. So that part absolutely makes sense. But when we looked at the black resume submissions, there was almost no significant increase when you had a better resume. So blacks with lower quality resumes had about the same callback rate as did blacks with the high quality resumes. So that's keying us into something. That is an issue, and that's certainly a problem. And again, you can see that real quickly here. White resumes, low quality resumes, that's the callback number or callback rate. The high white resumes, there you go, and almost no difference between the low and high quality resumes for African Americans. So part of what we interpret this as, or what these researchers interpreted this as, was that there's still this differential treatment in the labor market. And there's still a way that race matters, and even online, when you don't see the person, you don't interview the person, there still is a way that it tends to matter and influence the rate of being called in for an interview. And then the last point is that for African Americans and people of color, even with improved skills and more education, their job prospects don't tend to benefit from that. And again, that's a problem, because you're working hard, getting degrees, but it still isn't adding more job prospects.